Mark from the Abstract here again. In the last tutorial, we discussed a certain type of cadence, a dominant seventh cadence, particularly focusing on what a dominant seventh chord is and its functions. In this tutorial, we're going to focus on a different type of cadence, one called a deceptive cadence. Before we do that, I loaded in a MIDI region, a chord progression from one of my favorite Beatles songs of all time. For those of you who don't know the Beatles, I'm sorry. Definitely get familiar with them. But this is the start of the chord progression for the song Something. I'm going to go ahead and just play it once, and then we'll talk about it. And now let me do it again with my crappy vocal on top so you can recognize the melody. Something in the way she moves attracts me like no other lover. Something in the way she moves me. I don't want to leave her now. So yeah, there's obviously more to the melody, more to the song, but I stopped there for a particular reason. Before we get into that reason, I want to talk about dominance a little bit more. There's a couple different types of dominant resolutions in this chord progression that we might have already noticed or not. For those of you who did not, let's talk about that. We talked about dominant seventh resolution being a very strong type of cadence because it involves a lot of tension in the dominant chord releasing into a less tense, usually one chord of the key that we're in. But the Beatles chose to include a few different dominant resolutions in this chord progression. Let's find the first one. So the first chord is just a C major chord, and then he makes it a C major seventh chord by dropping the top C down to a B. Just a strong C, and then a C major seventh. So now what do we have here? If we were to isolate these two chords, I'm going to mute these, I'm going to mute all these. We actually have a dominant resolution. If this song were in the key of F, which it kind of, it is in the key of F for a few bars, and then it goes outside of F back to C. It's kind of all over the place, which is okay. But if we were to isolate these two chords and put them out of context, we actually have a 5-1 resolution right before our eyes. If this song was going to be in F major, which this chord is, F major. Why F major? Well, it's got the bass as the F, the root, major third, fifth, F major chord. The chord before that is a C chord, a certain type of C chord. It's got the C on the bottom, followed by the major third, which is the E, perfect fifth, minor seventh. It's got the major third, minor seventh interval again, that tritone. And when you have that, you know you have a dominant seventh chord. So between measures 3 and 4, we actually have a dominant seventh to 1 resolution. So you could tell, if this song, like I said, was going to be only in the key of F, that would be a very strong way to bring it back to F. But the Beatles take it a step further, actually. In measure 5, they actually land on a dominant chord again. I'm going to go ahead and unmute everything. This chord right here is a D dominant seventh chord. Why? Well, D is the root, followed by the major third, perfect fifth, minor seventh again. Major third, minor seventh. So they had a dominant resolution between these two chords. They have what looks to be the setup of a dominant seventh resolution in a D dominant seventh. What does it resolve to? Well, let's listen. Recognize the dominant. Now, there's something a little different between this example and the last example where we discussed dominance between these two chords. Now, between these two chords, when we resolve to this chord right here, which is a certain type of G chord, there's something that's not quite fully resolved. And if you don't know what that is, I'll tell you. The Beatles actually resolved this dominant to another dominant chord. They could have very easily taken out the minor seventh of this G chord, which in this case is that F right here, which would have given us this cleaner sound. Now it seems like we're in the key of G, and D is just setting up that key. We could have very well ended the song or ended the chord progression on that G because it's very stable there. But the second we add that seventh, it's not as stable anymore. The reason it's not as stable anymore is because when it resolved from this chord to this chord, it actually resolved to another type of dominant chord, which maintains that interval of a tritone. Where is that interval? Well, we got the seventh of the chord right here. And where's the third? It's a B. That's the dissonant interval. So with that interval in there, it sort of demands another type of resolution. So what the Beatles demonstrate is you can treat dominant chords not just as ways to resolve back to our original key. You can resolve a dominant chord to another dominant chord to take us to a different key even further. So that's exactly what they did. Now, typically, if we were going to, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and separate these two chords right here. Command T at both sides. And then I'm going to duplicate the track by holding down Command D. And I'm going to Option drag this region right here real quick. I'm going to mute this track. So if we isolate this particular chord progression or this particular cadence between the D dominant seventh resolving to a G dominant seventh, what they typically could have done is resolve this chord to C, which is the home bass, because G is the 5 of the key of C. And they're kind of setting it up that way because they have a G dominant seventh chord. So typically what they could have done is resolve it. Let's do that real quick. I'm going to put C. And then for those of you who are, still trying to figure out the types of notes in a major chord, it's got the major third, perfect fifth, and if we're doing seventh chords, it's a major seventh chord. So if we're doing common tones, let's G. We'll keep the B there for the major seventh. Oops, Option drag. And then that's D. And what we could do is double the root, or we can go up to the third. I'm going to double the root and take away the major seventh right there to give a strong 5-1 cadence to C. When we take it a step further than that, we have two dominant chords with the D dominant seventh, into the G dominant seventh, into the C. That is a type of cadence known as a 2-5-1 cadence, where as opposed to just resolving from the 5 back to the home bass, you use the 2 chord of the key, which in the key of C, the 2 chord would be D, and you set up the 5 chord to then resolve to the 1 chord. If you know anything about jazz or R&B, 2-5-1s are used anywhere, or everywhere, excuse me. That sounds typical. You might not have, been able to identify that sort of chord progression or cadence until right now, but you've probably heard something like that, in your lifetime. But that's not what the Beatles did. The Beatles decided to deceive us. They decided to do exactly the type of cadence that would deceive us. And the reason we call it a deceptive cadence is because when we resolve it, we're actually resolving it to a chord that listeners weren't expecting. By now, hopefully you were expecting to hear this chord as the sort of chord that needs to be resolved into in this chord progression. In this particular case, the Beatles avoided that because they were that cool. They wanted to be a little bit different. And this is what they did. Why would they do that? I really don't know. I couldn't answer that question. But part of the cool thing about being artistic is being able to make these choices in very smart ways. They chose to set up what would be a typical dominant to 1 resolution or a 5-1 resolution, but they didn't give us the 1. They give us a new chord. In this case, this new chord happens to be the 6th degree, or the chord built off of the 6th degree of a C major scale, which is A, C, D, E, F, G, A. And in a C major, in the key of C major, the chord that is built off the 6th position is always going to be minor. And all they did was give us the minor 6th as opposed to resolving to 1. Let's isolate that. There's no correct way to do it, but they chose to deliver that deceptive cadence to fool listeners. And that's one of my favorite things to do as an artist, is to fool listeners in my production, giving them something that they're not expecting. And traditionally, when you're doing chord progressions, a deceptive cadence is a really common way to do that without sounding jarring or out of place. The deceptive cadences could really add a lot of color to your music. So if you have any questions on that, let me know. I'm here to help. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next tutorial.